About the monkey. The monkey is a second page anyway, so. Stop stretching. Ow! Ow! Two 7 more pieces. Or the cat with the framework.
You might bring out maybe we'll go to Denver when it's good. Regardless, it's going to get a lot of ideas.
Good evening, everybody. So a little test, see if everybody can hear me.
Sure can.
All right. That's all good. Give a few more minutes for people to come in. There we go. Sting. Okay. Okay, one more. No echo. Hi, Shadia. So, okay, I heard a little echo just now. Let's see if that is gone. Everybody can still hear me? Yep. Okay. Very good. Oh, okay. All right. All right. Okay. I think that's probably enough time for everybody to make their way here. So thank you everybody for coming in again. And you can see we've got quite a few people in here. That's all good. We hopefully a few of the new parents have joined us this week with the kids. We had a few very full classes today, which was a lot of fun to see. And tomorrow's even more. So yeah, like we had a little break last week because of the well, we need some time to relax as well. Although I spent a lot of time working on reports with your kids, which was a lot of fun. And yeah, like for those that are here, we have a few topics that I want to talk about, particularly when it comes to giftedness, because we have quite a few new parents here. I thought it would be good to sort of start off like talking about what giftedness is and what we need to like what that means really, like what is the definition, like what is the background, maybe a little bit of history, because it's been, I don't think I've actually shared that with any of you before. So it would be fun to sort of go on a little bit of a 125-year-old journey of where giftedness comes from, and then maybe talk a bit about where a lot of the stigmas and a lot of the other issues come from that basically we run into as parents of gifted kids. And then we'll delve into the two questions that I want to deal with, because they're sort of very closely related. But of course, in any time, any of you have a bit of extra questions, want clarification, just please like chime in, type it in the chat, and I'll do what I can to answer your questions as good as I can. So the agenda is what is giftedness? I'm going to start with that. Then why is my child so sensitive, which is quite a broad topic, very interesting question, of course. And how does like overexcitability shape the experiences of gifted kids, which is kind of similar, a question, maybe a bit more eloquently worded, but I'm sure you go between both of those questions in your head quite a lot when kids struggle the way that they do. So I want to talk to you about a few important situations in giftedness, and that is the Chen actually he wrote in the handbook of the American Association for Psychology about giftedness, defined in his review, his literary review, that there's about 3 different paradigms that giftedness has gone through in the last 120 years or so. And it all started really with Terman. Terman coined the idea of giftedness. He also was the first guy that sort of invented IQ tests as a ways to measure somebody's intelligence. And it's kind of a controversial figure in a lot of ways, because Terman basically decided that like you're born gifted, and there wasn't a lot of scientific evidence for that at the time, but that was what his assumption was. And he said, okay, we need to find these gifted individuals, and if we do, and then when you support them, we should be able to create a crack team of super people. And what he did is he went out and found kids that he did a lot of IQ tests, found a bunch of kids that scored very high, and then basically said, let's follow these kids for as long as we can. And that this particular these studies took a long time, to the point that some of them were followed up until they were at 60 or so, to see how well they did. And the way he started with IQ test was basically focusing mostly on academic pursuits, which in layman's terms basically means anything to do with like academic studies or English and math, like higher mathematical ability. Now, it's always been the core focus of him in his questionnaires. That's what most of the universities cared about at this time. So he basically said, okay, that's it. Now, if that sounds familiar, living in Asia, then a little bit of that is thanks to him. right? And obviously, there is some truth to this. We know that math and English ability are important to somebody's success. But he said, okay, if I find these exceptional individuals in it, then we're good, we're golden. Now that lasted for quite a while, like for 80 years. That was sort of the prevalent standard when it came to IQ tests. And the way he defined that was, and he just said, okay, if I take 2 standard deviations of the mean, that is the people that I call gifted. And of course, that is one way to do this, but it's kind of an arbitrary number. Right, so he just said, okay, 2 standard deviations, that's it, done. And that wasn't challenged for much. And obviously, the bell curves that we all know and love, support a lot of these kind of situations. It is a small percentage of kids and people that fall within that outside of that 2 standard deviations. And that seemed to work fine for what he wanted to do. What is a little bit interesting, though, that there's more to that story. I'll get to that. So the second paradigm happened about from the 1980s to 2000s. 2000, like these lines are a little bit more blurry exactly because Renzulli and Monks actually were writing like a good 5 or 10 years earlier. But like it takes a while for a lot of stuff in academics sometimes to take hold. And basically they said no, it isn't just nature, it's nurture. Like if you develop these kids, then they will do fine. And that is kind of interesting, because the reason they went down that road is because all the Terman kids, or termites as they were called, like very few of them actually amounted to much. Right, so like he thought, we're going to find them, they're going to be great. And in terms of actual success, depending on how you define success, they didn't do particularly well. Right, so there's a lot of interesting thought at that time where people went like, oh, okay, well, why is that? And basically the models from Renzulli and then Monks that enhance that particular model go a little bit deeper into this, and I'll go into that in a second. And then the third paradigm is basically from 2000, 2010s, depending on how strong you define it. And the models become a lot more complex. And they basically say, actually, it's a bit of both. Right. So, and then I'll come down to the fourth paradigm, because I do think we are starting to move into a new era when it comes to giftedness. That is very interesting. But basically, this review is from 2014, if I'm not mistaken. So like we've gone a little bit further since, particularly since COVID, right? So let's have a look at a little bit of what that looks like. So of course, we all know these bell curves. So this is paradigm 1, termite. So what is giftedness in this? We have the standard deviation, as you can see. 68% of the population will fall within 1 standard deviation, and then the rest will fall within the 95% will fall within 2 standard deviations. And this is where maybe you guys remember some of the other presentations I've given. The actual Goldilocks zone in terms of like doing quite well is this blue area over here. Right, so this is anything between 115 to 130, and like obviously, like again, this line is a little bit blurry, but like an IQ of 120 seems to be the Goldilocks zone, and like that's when we say, okay, like Goldilocks zone is like who are the most successful in life, and we do tend to find that that's generally the people in that 120. And why is that? Like you say, well, I mean, a lot of theories, obviously, like when you're looking at such a small portion of the population, it's really hard to do meaningful research sometimes, particularly if you start asking questions like how much do you earn and all that kind of stuff. So you end up looking at like the hyper successful people and then work your way back. So like there's a lot of controversy on like, okay, are you biasly selecting people in these areas, and what does this all mean? Right. So but what we do know is that people in this particular region tend to still struggle in school enough for them to really work, like develop good metacognition skills. And it also means that they don't exhibit some of the behaviors we tend to see with gifted kids that make them asynchronously develop, which means they like to hang out with older kids and learn things that are more advanced, and therefore they don't engage with group work as much. So they socialize in different kinds of ways. And these are the kind of things that kids with an IQ of 120 don't have to deal as much with. And that doesn't mean if you're an IQ of 130, automatically antisocial, not at all. It's more likely that you'll develop antisocial behavioral patterns that don't help you. And then these are things like sitting in a playground reading, for example, rather than playing with their friends. And that's a very simple example of this. So that's where we see. So obviously, then we look like less than 2%. The deviations slightly sit between like that 2.3 to 2%. Obviously different populations, depending on where you take from, these curves can be a bit more flatter, and so there's some slight variations there. But on average, we see about like 2.5%. And that's what they were basically using in 1900s up until like somewhere around like 1980. Even though it's a long period, I don't want to delve too much into it, because honestly, a lot of the stuff was just plainly wrong. We know that now. But like, it's interesting to know that like there's still organizations out there that will sometimes say, oh, this is our selection point, and then basically people argue like, yeah, but you can have like an aptitude for music, and then you don't show up on an IQ test, and it's definitely true. So they're saying, well, technically, if we would put that in an IQ test, they're still in that 2 standard deviations. But there is some other scholars that say, actually, this range is way too small. We should be looking somewhere between this 120 plus, and that actually gets closer to about 10% of the population, right? So when you say, well, how do we define giftedness? Obviously, IQ alone is just not enough. And how broad you make it is also one of those things. And like, what should we do? What is the best way to say? Is it 2%? Is it 10%? I mean, and then the question I normally throw back is like, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to just make it exclusive for the sake of exclusivity, or is it for another reason? And this basically the question I ask the schools that ask me this, like, okay, well, what is it? 10%, 2%? What do I do? And I say, well, it depends on how much resources you have. And obviously, resources is in terms of time, classrooms, teachers, money, all these kind of things. Because like a lot of the scholars that say 10% is probably better say that the actual interventions in school, pull-out programs and other kind of facilities that you give to gifted kids actually are really good for all of those kids in 10%. And that's true. The only difference is, and this is where, again, socioeconomic situations and everything else have a lot of impact. Like, at what point do we say, okay, when do you need it, right? Because some kids will do better if they have access to this particular stuff, but at the same time, it's also like, okay, well, who needs it and who can't function without it? And that is also a thing. Like, so some gifted kids really need this support. And that's why I'm saying it's more of a resource question than about like, what is this exclusive club that we're in? And I think if you start looking at it from that perspective, things become a little bit clearer. Now, it won't surprise you that like in the 70s and 80s, that shift went a lot more towards almost like a social way of looking at stuff. So if you look at this model that you have here, basically this is Monk's and Renzulli's model. They're very similar. So this is Monk's and Renzulli. So this is, I think Renzulli is 1979, if I'm not mistaken. Monk's is a little bit later. It gets like to about like 2000s. But like he's done a few versions of this. But basically, what we're looking at here is that the original model said like, oh, okay, well, if you have 3 different factors, like, so above average ability, which is a bit of like, are you born with it, or did you learn how to do this? So you have a skill to begin with, and if you have motivation and then you have creativity, if all those 3 things align, you should see gifted behavior. And so what Renzulli and Monks were arguing for is that actually schools should try to foster these 3 things. Creativity, motivation, ability, which in a sense you can practice, so rote learning, all that kind of stuff. And Monks basically added school family and friends as outside factors, where you said, well, it's not just the internal things happening within the child, it is also the stuff around it. Because we can see that people that come from a good school tend to display gifted behavior better than or more than kids that don't. Kids that have a good family structure tend to do better, and kids that have good friend support and so on. So these things are very important. Like, so this whole model basically says, yeah, you need to look on the inside, you need to look on the outside, but at its core, what they were saying, it's everybody can be gifted kind of statement. And I think a lot of you have heard that term, like everybody is gifted, and like this is the thing. The term "gifted," as coined by Termite, really refers to people that behave exceptionally well in a particular field. And in academics, it's always been referring to people that have sort of innate abilities that are stronger. And obviously, in this particular situation, people were saying, like in the 80s, like, oh, actually, everybody can become gifted. And what I say is like, no, everybody can become talented. Like, I think maybe it's a good time to define the difference between the two, because you often see gifted and talented. And to me, talented is somebody that shows an expertise in a particular field, right? And it doesn't like technically, when you describe somebody as talented, to me, it doesn't really matter if they acquire that by tens of thousands of hours of practice, or whether they acquired it because they just seem to be a natural, have a natural ability in it. Like, they're still talented. And I think when I look at what giftedness is, for me, giftedness is like people that are born with a natural ability. And there's a good chance that they never develop that ability into a talent. Right? So they're two separate things. And the goal, of course, is to get everybody to be talented. And I think every child deserves the kind of support and time needed to develop those kind of skills. And every child will have its own journey. Particularly non-gifted kids will need to maybe spend a little bit more time on things. But at the same time, because they needed to spend more time, they've developed more grit. Therefore, long term, they actually become better at learning these things than a lot of our gifted kids are. And that's basically where I see a lot of disconnect to what is happening in the UK, because you'll probably run into some teachers sometimes that will say, like, oh, like, we don't do gifted and talented stuff in the UK. And like almost all the gifted and talented programs in the UK have been defunded. The research into it has been defunded. Like, ever since they've done that, there's been a dip in satisfaction in overall school, which is concerning, and an increase in dropout rates, and an increase in social challenges and well-being challenges as well, and with a lot more suicide and other kind of challenges that kids run into. So I find the idea that like everybody should be gifted, we shouldn't be doing anything to help them is just plain wrong. And unfortunately, it's a little bit of the leftover of this second paradigm, because the truth is always a little bit more in the middle. Now, obviously, with more stuff in the middle, you don't have these nice, like, oh, this is a very nice, simple model. Isn't it awesome? Right? Like, I can explain this in 1 minute. I mean, I can't, because I'm always talking a lot, as you guys know, but I mean, technically it should only take a minute. This is maybe like 2-3 minutes. Great. And then the truth, though, is probably a bit more like this. And it's like, oh man, this is getting a lot more complex. Like, what do we do? And this is also one of the reasons why I strongly believe that, like, just saying, oh, every teacher should, just do this easily. That's just really unfair, because asking them to know all of this, and the thing is, like, for any kids that, like, because this is not ADHD, as we know, but any kids with ADHD, ASD, like any type, like maybe dyslexia, you name it, they all have similar kind of challenges and all kinds of models and interventions. And should any single teacher know all of them? Is that a fair thing? Because, like, for me, just to study this model and the background behind it, I don't know, that took me a good 6 months of reading, because this is quite a nice, neat model as an educator to fall back on, but it's really complex. So I'm going to try and explain to you a little bit like what this is. But if you're really interested, Gagne's this is DMTG model, and this is the 2.0 model. To be honest, DMTG 2.0 for those that want to know. So okay, so what Gagne says is a few interesting things. Like this 10%, that's that 10% that I was talking about. Like he's one of the scholars that says, yeah, about 10% is technically gifted. So natural ability, and he called them gifts. So again, he keeps with the terminology, and then he says, well, giftedness obviously can take lots of different forms. So what do we have? So we have the mental and the physical part. So he was already quite unique in that he said, actually, it's not just in the head. There's something else there that we know. So mentally, though, we have intellectual factors, we have creative factors, we have social factors, and we have perceptual vectors, so observational kind of things. And within those, these are things that you can actually observe in kids quite early on. 2 years old, like obviously the social ones could be a little bit more tricky, but like even we can see indicators of like really good social aptitude with babies reading their parents quicker than others. Which is very interesting work. Unfortunately, early year stuff is also very scarce. And if you guys remember Xing Li, my colleague from Hong Kong, that was a couple of weeks ago, she said, like, I was doing a little bit of research, and the number of the amount of scholarly articles, particularly around giftedness this last year, was like maybe 200 versus over 10,000 articles in the SCN departments and so on. Right, so there's a lot of work that in academics that needs to be done that unfortunately isn't. And that comes with another problem. That means that like you can make a really nice living just doing the academic stuff without having to get in front of a classroom. And that is, that's easy because it's a lot easier to talk about stuff than to actually do it sometimes. So this is one of the reasons I want to bring it to you so that you have a bit of an understanding, because like we need to really help the scholars sometimes getting information. So like if anybody approaches you and says, hey, I've heard that your kids have enrolled in a gifted and talented program, like, can we do some research? Keep in mind that like the research that is needed to help advocate for stuff and get resources from governments and things is really depending on that stuff. So keep that in mind. Okay, so that's the natural abilities, all great. But once their natural abilities hit a social environment, things start changing, right? So we go from nature to nurture in a sense. And what is that change? Like what are we looking for? Well, I mean, we have basically two differences. We have the developmental process, so like how do people learn, like what things happen, and essentially like what kind of factors can you invest in to have a positive impact on that. So if you look at the developmental process, you have activities like so, and differences in access or content and format have an impact on how well you develop a particular thing. And that's very simple. Like if you have someone that is socially pretty strong, so he's good at reading people and he's good at listening and good at like responding. If you put that person in a situation where they can go for debate clubs and things like that, they will develop more strongly than kids that don't. And this is kind of where like a lot of parents know, like, oh, if I let my kids do all these kind of things, they will have an opportunity to actually do more activities. And like by investing and basically forcing them to invest time, money, and energy in there, my kids will do better. And to a certain extent, that is really true. Like, so this is one of the reasons why a lot of Asian attitudes towards education seem to work really well. That's like thousands of years of experience in that. So that's absolutely true. But I think where we miss out a little bit is that we don't necessarily know why that is. Because most of it's like, oh, we know this happens. And it's sort of like the underpan gnomes. It's like, okay, like first step, developmental process, second step, question mark, third step, profit. And And that is, unfortunately, there's more to it, right? So before we dive into that step in between, because like understanding why things happen is really important, is basically these catalysts. So this is where we basically people that don't know what the actual impacts on certain things are will say, okay, as long as I make some activities happen, we're good to go. And that's like, okay, like I dump my kids in a center that is just going to do some coding, we should be good, right? And then we know that they'll do well because they know they have a skill. But technically, that is really missing out on particular catalysts that make these things much more strong. And particularly for gifted kids, like the way that I tend to describe this is that we know that gifted kids have more ability, and I'll go a little bit more deeply into why that is from a neurological perspective. But we know that that's the case. So so anything negative or positive happening to them just has like an extra factor. So it just affects them stronger. Now that is both, again, a good or a bad thing, because if you do something good, great. You do something bad, unfortunately, the impact is worse as well, right? So this is one of the reasons why I do these talks for parents like you, because if you don't know what the real levers are and what the catalysts are, then making them do activities, but they're doing it in a way that they don't want to, they get really frustrated and angry with it, actually could do more damage than good. And the steps you need to take to help are actually not that hard. That's the good news. But you do have to be very consistent, right? So what are the two things? So we have some things intrapersonal, like things that are inside of themselves, and then some things environmental. Now, obviously, when it comes to environmental catalysts, you guys have a lot of opportunities to impact that. Like what kind of social circles and things your kids are in is actually kind of an important one. The quality of your friends do define the quality of your own life. That is definitely true. And those are hard lessons for a lot of us to learn. That you've probably had some people around you that were a little bit difficult to be around, that basically kept you down. Right? So you need to provide that. But like, is that possible within your own means? But don't forget that one of the most important people in your kids' lives is you. So how you act makes a very big difference, right? And so that comes to the individuals, the parents, the family, those, and then essentially provision. So being a bit clever about things that they want. I'll come back to a little bit of things like agency a little bit later, like why that is so important. But yeah, so we have all these catalysts. If you want to go into really big detail, read his works. They're quite easily available for free. But then if all these things work together, then the competencies, so these are the talents that end up as a result, should be in these particular fields. Now, the RIA-SEC is a bit of like a prelude to STEAM. STEAM picked up a little bit bigger. It's like a little bit more fancy. It's like easy to remember. But if you look at like what he talks about, it's technically all there, right? So he looks at academics, and he groups math and sciences and stuff in there. But like, I think the important difference is that, and I find this very interesting working with all the kids that I work with, is that the way that the kids look at academics, they don't quite get what that difference is. So applying for academic pursuits is very different than trying to get a degree to work somewhere. And one of the things I try to teach, like what we used to see with a lot of gifted kids, is that a disproportional amount of them would actually end up in academics. Like for good or bad, like that really depends. Like some academic fields are great to be in for income purposes, and some are not. So if the measure is like how successful they are based on how much income you have, like even that doesn't really mean always everything. But like what is very interesting is that not that many people really would like their kids to go into academics for maths, for example. Right? So it's like math is great, and if a kid then says, I want to actually, study math just for the sake of studying math in university. A lot of okay, are you sure? Like, are you sure you're going to do that? Because the field to get really high in that is tricky, and it's hard to get funding for it because it's not super sexy either, right? So that's the academic. So he puts that kind of separate. But then RIASEC, which is technical science, arts, social services, administration, and sales, business operations, like these are your more like your skill-based kind of situations, and this has almost been completely replaced by STEAM nowadays. But as you can see, STEAM is missing a few things, right? So what is kind of interesting is that like if you look at like STEAM, the business part is kind of gone, the social part is kind of gone, and the rest is still there. Like even you'd argue like this is also not really there. So like STEM fields, like shoving an A in there, kind of difficult. But yeah, so I use this particular other phrase, which is called SAGE. So SAGE basically, SAGE is sports, and then academics, games, and empathy. So the idea being that actually he talks about, like Gagne talks about sports and talks about games quite a bit as well. But but basically, if you just look at STEAM, nobody really cares about that. But we know that, like particularly in Korea, if you're in games, and technically you could argue that like e-games are kind of like sports, or esports are games too. You can actually make a really good living out of that. And the skill level that you need to be really good at that is actually kind of interesting. Now, academics is that same field that we have here. I still think that there's a real big difference to somebody who wants to become an engineer and somebody who wants to become an academic in engineering. Those two, one is about just reading things for the sake of reading stuff, and the other is about actually like designing and making things, which is really different. Right. So, but this also has the traditional history and geography in there. And I find what is very interesting here in Asia. I had one of the girls come in from the UK. She just came in a couple of months ago, and we talked a bit. And her favorite subjects is like, oh, history and geography. And I said, like, well, here they do humanities, and they're like, she's like, what is that? Like everybody here knows humanities because it's taken what the traditional academic pursuits, because these are the things that basically made like universities happen. Like people went across the world sailing on ships. But yeah, they basically were there, and this is where like when you look at gifted kids, a lot of gifted kids are like really engrossed in history, and they're really engrossed in geography. And they don't necessarily have the way to express that in their classes here. And now that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best path forward for them. But it's interesting that like we don't necessarily do that much with it anymore, even though that traditionally was like why universities were started. So okay, so that's what we tend to measure, like all these competencies. Where do we end up? And that's the third paradigm. Now, the fourth paradigm that I wanted to talk to you about is are they neurodivergent? That's a good question. Like what? Like, is neurodivergent is kind of a catch-all term for any of the other different SCNs that you've seen, because we know for people that have ADHD and that are on the spectrum that there is different brain patterns and stuff. So they're neurologically divergent. So are gifted people neurodivergent as well? And there's been hot debates about that because it's always been very hard to see. But there's a very interesting, the very first, well, not necessarily the first, but one very big one is Einstein's brain. I don't know if ever you guys have heard about this, but Einstein's brain was taken for science, been cut into many bits and pieces. It's been researched, and it still is being researched in a lot of universities, which is kind of a fun thing. There's a lot of controversy around it, whether he wanted that to happen or not. That really is not up to me to decide. But together with Huberman's work at MIT and a few of his colleagues that look a lot more at like neurological science with brain waves and and all that kind of stuff. There's lots of different brain patterns that they can see. We're starting to see that there is really a difference. So now Einstein's research is a bit controversial because most of the time we don't tend to cut people's brains up that much, and it's also quite difficult to do because it's quite a long time ago that they did this. So how much of it has been preserved, how much of it is biased, like all that stuff. But there's a few distinct things that they could see that people agree was different. So a very big interesting thing is the lateral sulcus, which is sort of like I would say like a membrane wall between different parts of the brain, also called the Sylvian fissure, was like distinctly different in his brain. Like, and what the theory is that it allowed for neurons to fire quicker and the information to spread quicker between different parts of the brain. Right. So, and we can see this in the brain scan activity as well. Like the brain activity is more intense, like significantly so. But we've never done brain scans in that way from Einstein's brain, but we could see, okay, there's some difference there. There also was a very interesting bit where the hippocampus had different sizes in the different parts of the brain. Like, so it was, I believe on the left side, it was bigger than on the right side. And that is something you don't tend to see with a lot of others. And then the other thing is the corpus callosum. This is basically what they were looking at is like the fibers in particular parts of the brain. Like and again they could see that they're bigger and they basically before they started doing these brain scans that they can do now. The theory was that this would all allow information to move much quicker between parts of the brain, which is why he was considered more intelligent. And it seems that particular that thought is more close. That theory is probably closer to the truth than we thought it was going to be. So that is that's a real yes. They are neurodivergent. Okay, so might be good to see like if any of you guys have some questions around this, just put them in chat for me because like I want to move on to the next bit. But like please put them in chat so that I can answer some more stuff. So just to bring it, we have 3 paradigms over the last 125 years, and basically we're starting to realize that the neurodivergence is really a thing. Now, how to then get us to why is my child so sensitive? And the short answer is sits also in that like nature nurture kind of thing. The real reason is why they're sensitive. Well, because they're missing parts of their brain that stop you being sensitive to things, most likely, and that's assuming that their brain is like Einstein is not necessarily missing, but has like smaller lateral sulcuses. But that's one. Like, so there is less of a delay, less of a barrier between things. And this might be kind of interesting. Like, why is my child so sensitive? Like, there's this 90-second rule, a little bit arbitrary, but like it takes 90 seconds, generally speaking, for certain like emotional thoughts to calm down and so on. And what we tend to see is that this is unfortunately a lot longer in gifted kids as well. So there's some thoughts on that where that has something to do with their with basically stuff more resonating more within their brain. So that is one. So from a nature perspective, it's because it is more sensitive. And that isn't fair, but that is definitely something that they have to learn how to deal with. So that is one. But there is a nurture part to this, because what you tend to see with gifted kids is that they tend to avoid the social situations, for example, to have less of these triggers. And that's what we call asynchronous development. So where most of their peers, age peers, would run into these particular situations, experience the emotion, go through it, learn how to cope with it, calm themselves down, like change their behavior as a result. So a lot of behaviors that we as people display tend to happen after we have sort of chemically, neurologically programmed our brains to respond in a certain way. And and that basically what we can see with kids like this is that rather than to deal with it, they avoid the situation. And then they get worse at it. Like it's like going to the gym. If you stop going to the gym, you'll not be able to lift as much heavy weights. And then if you then go, well, I can't lift as much weights as my friend, so therefore I'm not going to show up because I'm embarrassed. It's going to get worse. It's not going to get better. And that is the same for any kind of social situation. So that is the first one. The second bit here. So how does that then shape the experiences of a gifted child? Now this is tricky because that obviously is really wide. It can be everywhere. And honestly, this is where you as a parent have to really figure out, like, okay, what is my role in this? What can I do to help kids with this? And that is one of those things where you as a parent yourself, like, whether you have been there, you have been allowing them. And this is also where actually a particular kind of parenting is really, really, really important. And that is, in Holland, we call these helicopter parents. But so helicopter parents, we all know, we call them tiger parents in Malaysia. So helicopter parents. Sorry, my cat is like going off. Like, can you ask him to stop? There you go, take him. So okay. After that brief intermission. So helicopter parents, tiger parents. So the idea being you have a child, you're hovering over them, you're making sure that they do things, you don't let them make their own choices, you make sure that they do. And what you're doing is you're taking agency away. You're also putting a lot of pressure, like particularly being observed all the time. Like, you're yourself, if you're at work and your boss comes looking over your shoulder to see how you're doing, you're not going to be as relaxed. You're probably going to make more mistakes. And then if that gets pointed out, then these kind of situations are not very fun. So that's helicopter parents. But there is another kind of parent, and we call them curling parents. Now, who knows what curling is? Like, any of you guys have heard of that particular term before? The Olympic sport. I know we live in the tropics in Malaysia, so we don't get a lot of ice. But it's the sport where you get a broom and you have to basically like polish the ice for like these, I don't know what you call them, pucks, to score points. And basically, curling parents are parents that are constantly trying to take any kind of resistance away from their kids, which, whether it's like, oh, the school isn't doing what they need from me, and they're not always wrong. Like that's, let me be clear, that's definitely not always the case. But it's like the constant thing that they're telling everybody else is like, okay, things aren't going the way I want, therefore I need to help my child, and I do that by preventing any of these mishaps and challenges to happen, right? So and unfortunately, gifted kids tend to be very susceptible to this, because we know that like being gifted is actually something that is inherited, right? So obviously the differences in brain, the functionality that we can see, it comes from somewhere, right? So if that comes from somewhere, it is very likely that there's parents that are basically having had that experience themselves. So what is the natural response? I don't want my child to go through that kind of challenge because I had a terrible time here. Let me fix that. I'm worried about my child. And of course you should be worried about your child. Like you don't want distress for your child. But what you're doing is you're basically reinforcing the asynchronous development. And that is really dangerous. So what happens is with a lot of kids that have curling parents is we see markers of PTSD. And that is concerning, right? Like, so you can, the center of the brain that basically governs PTSD is the same center that basically governs making decisions. It's so anybody suffering from PTSD cannot make decisions well. Now, PTSD is technically a state of fear, so we're sort of back here, like we always get to fear. But like what is really interesting is that, sadly interesting, is that the impact on kids' regions of the brain, but with like from a neurological perspective, with PTSD, is worse with really extremely overbearing curling parents than it is for children in an abusive house, and that is scary, right? So you're almost better off from a neurologic perspective to be in an abusive relationship where the father or the mother beats the child at home than it is to live with parents that basically say, no, everything is dangerous, don't do anything, don't touch that, and obviously there you have to prevent, like, and this is difficult because curling parents obviously do most of this out of love, right? So like they're not doing this because they're trying to get PTSD to happen. And now this happens with normal kids, but unfortunately, if you 3x this because you're a gifted kid and your brain is more active, therefore it feels more difficult, this could be really dangerous, right? So if you have feelings like, oh, maybe I am a parent like this sometimes, and what I find is a lot of parents that I work with that have this challenge know that that's the case, but they're scared themselves, right? So they're not really rationally behaving in that situation, and it's hard. Like it's like if you see like and this is a thing like in Holland is actually very common for us to let our kids just wander off, and we do watch them, right? So we like the concept of unsupervised play is really like for me it's like it's not unsupervised, but it's more like uninterrupted, like so we don't intervene at all. And it is one of those really important situations where like when you're in this kind of social situation and the kids are walking around, like if you were to just tell no, you're not allowed to walk away, it's dangerous, you can't do anything, and it's like don't talk to anybody, you know, like everybody's dangerous, then the whole world becomes a scary place, and then they become shy and withdrawn, and then it's like, okay, like we know that that's not good. It makes them more agreeable to things. Being agreeable means that you're more likely to say yes to abusive relationships at work or at home. It means that you're less likely to ask for a raise. So all of these things have a lot of impact on their future success. So that's important. So what should you do then? Well, like what you should do is like have a kid that just keeps walking away rather than forcefully holding them. It's like, well, let them, as far as they're concerned, get lost, right? So you look from a distance and see like that things are okay. And if somebody comes and tries to swoop up the child, of course you step in. But you see like whenever I fly to the Netherlands on my flight, I always see these little toddlers that are basically they'll be sometimes they're like a Dutch family or a mixed Dutch family, but you see the kids like wander around and you see a lot of parents looking around like, is there no parent here? But me knowing that this is a Dutch kid because I'm on a flight to Amsterdam, I only have to look a little bit around to see maybe mom or dad standing a little bit further away where the child can see her, to see, okay, if it's nobody doing anything with it. And then you see the kids like, you know, like they get spoken to by adults on occasion, and yeah, so there's a lot of stuff there. Now, what does that mean for gifted kids? Again, same, they're still children. They need these particular kind of interactions, but their intelligence, and unfortunately a lot of the gifted parents' own experiences when they were old, put them in situations where very often they feel, okay, I can't trust the world enough to let my kid experience these kind of hardships so that they can build up the resilience against it. And I think that is basically the biggest fear, the biggest challenge for them. I mean, funny enough, it doesn't always have to be fear. Like it could just be overexcitement. Somebody that's a little bit too happy in the inappropriate times struggles just as much with their situation. So, and this is why it seems that they go from happy to sad like so quickly. Again, the brain itself functions differently. Not better, not worse. It's just different challenges. I think that answers those questions, I hope. Any questions from you guys today? Like anything that you still want me to ask or want to ask me about giftedness, about overexcitabilities? I would love to hear them. And then that might be a good opportunity for me to tell you that this Saturday, we're actually going to be at the International School Fair in Mid-Valley. And we're going to be doing some assessments for anybody that comes in with a Cat 4 or a WISC-5 test that says, hey, I'm gifted. So if you have any friends that are maybe not enrolled in the schools that your kids are enrolled in, that you think, oh, that would be a good fit, you just send them over to Mid-Valley. We have a booth there. It would be great to talk to them. If you're there yourself, come by, say hi. I'd love to see you guys there as well. And then if that is it, really no questions, no hands. No, then I think I'm just going to call it a night. I think thank you all for staying with me this whole time. If you have any, yeah, let's go ahead. I interrupted you. That's all right. So yeah, thanks everybody. It's lovely seeing you all. Next week we're going to be there as well. I'll keep an eye out on a poll that I will have for you guys, because I've heard from some of you might want to do every other week like a different time so that more people can watch this. So yeah, great to have you. Have a good evening, and I'll see you all very soon.
Good night.